Hi, I'm Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio, and in this video today I'm showing you a couple of the blocks in the Broken Star Quilt and how I quilted them. This one is the Ohio Star block, and I started by finding the center of this block, and I chose to do a spiral feather in this one, and I just found the center, just kind of eyeballing it, and then I'm just swinging out with the spiral and then swinging out with the feathers. Now this has the quilting thread color is Fad, and this is by Signature, and it's a variegated thread, and it does show up pretty well against this yellow. So as I am tracing back over the tops of these feathers, if I don't get right on top of the previous quilting, it shows like a little shadow, but I wasn't too worried about that on this quilt, and everything seemed to work pretty well. Now the quilting on this is fairly simple. I haven't done anything elaborate in the blocks. Most of the elaborate quilting is in the background. Now this section of the block is just going to be continuous curve, and I started with circling around the square and then doing the continuous curve on the other angles of the triangle and just bringing it all the way around. And I am in stitch regulated mode here, and I'm also going to do continuous curve in the star points and just follow that all the way around. So the quilting isn't complicated, it's not elaborate, it's just pretty simple quilting, and that makes the quilting go faster, and yet you still get a nice look to the block. Now I don't have any tape of the background quilting that I did in this block, and that's because I chose to use a black thread in the background of the four blocks that are in the corners of the quilt. This is where I didn't want to detract from the star in the center of the quilt, so I chose to use a black thread in there, and for some reason I forgot to videotape that. So in two of these corner blocks I don't have the background quilting, and this is the other one. This is a rising star block. This is the one with the star in the center of the star block, so we have two stars here. Now this center quilting is similar to the spin feather in that it just goes around from the center, but the center, it doesn't have a spiral in it. This is just a center point that I'm reaching back to, and so it gives it a little bit of a different look. It actually looks a little more traditional than what the spin feather does. And this is also with the quilt color Fad. Fad was used in all the colored sections of the quilt. So just two thread colors in this quilt, the variegated Fad and then a black. And this green fabric just kind of glows under the light of my quilting machine, so you can't hardly see the stitching on this video, and I apologize for that, but there's not much I can do about it at this point. But this is a continuous curve in the star points again, and just right back into stitch regulated mode. Now you can do this real easily in manual mode because it isn't a complicated quilting design. It's pretty simple. So just going to cut my threads and then work on the outer star points, and for those I'm also doing a continuous curve. So once again, that's just pretty simple quilting. And for this one I started with the outer edges of the points of the star, and then I'll come back in and do the continuous curve around the inner sections of the triangles. So this is kind of relaxing quilting because it doesn't take a lot of concentration. The pattern is the same all the way around the quilt, and basically you just have to kind of watch for your thread tails there, which I could have stopped and cut those off, but for some reason I chose to just let them hang there on this block here. So that is all done in this block. And as I said, this is another block that I didn't get the background quilting taped, so I don't have any video of that. And then we're going to come to the next block. This one is near the center of the quilt. This is the Constellation star block, and there are, I think, 3 blocks in this quilt that are fairly similar to this, and I use the same pattern in all of those blocks. Now this is a take on a feather design, only it's instead of rounded at the tip, it has a little dip in it. So I made it look more like a leaf than a feather, and this is just going, the feathers aren't going on both sides of the triangle or the diamond, they're just on one side, and I'm alternating them. So all of the quilting goes one direction in the solid color fabric, and in the printed fabric it goes in the opposite direction. So this was another pretty relaxing design. It's fairly easy to do. It's just I have to remember to switch the pattern from one side to the other as I go around. And this is also the variegated thread, and you can see that a lot better in the solid color fabric. It doesn't show up as well in the fabrics that have a lot of print in them. And once again, I'm in stitch regulated mode, which this is another one that could be done real easily in manual mode. One thing about variegated thread, they do cost more, but they give you a lot of impact, so they're really lovely threads. But if you want the impact from them, it's best to use them in solid colored fabrics. You can see them a lot better there. And then another thing about them is that they're a little bit more fragile than a solid color fabric. I guess it has to do with the dyeing process. I'm not sure exactly why, but they will break a little bit more easily as you're running the machine, which is another reason why I'm in stitch regulated mode. If I go in manual mode, I tend to go quite a bit faster with my quilting, and running faster, if you think about it, the thread is running through the eye of your needle faster, which is heating up that needle, and along with the friction of that needle going up and down between your 3 layers of your quilt, that needle gets hot and it can cut your fabric. You may notice that if you're using a metallic thread, it does the same thing. Your metallic threads may break a lot easier than a cotton thread or a polyester thread, and I believe that's from that friction on the needle and the needle getting hot. And the reason I believe that is because I did a lot of quilting with metallic threads at one point, and when that thread would break, if I touched the needle, that needle would be really, really hot. So what I would do was slow down, and I would oil that port that goes to the needle. I'd oil that really well before I start, and then I'd oil it several times within the process of quilting the project, and that helped prevent a lot of the thread breakage. And there is that design all completed, and you can see that in those solid color fabrics pretty well. Now I'm working on the background. Now for this I used a piece of chalk, and I marked my design and how I wanted it to go in the quilt. And these are just straight lines, and I'm using a little straight line ruler. This is the scalloped, the small, I think it's called the mini scalloped ruler, and this is by Handy Quilter. And I'm just taking my time with that one too, also in stitch regulated mode, which I usually do when I'm using a template or a ruler. I will be in stitch regulated mode. That helps prevent a lot of problems down the line. Then just stitching in the ditch to get to the next section. And this is another straight line design, forming kind of like 2 boxes around the square. but instead of going completely around, I'm breaking it at the seam, going to the seam and stitching in the ditch to the next line. It gives it a little bit different look, a little bit more modern look than if I just did two lines, just two boxes within that square. So this is slower, but I like the look of it. And that variegated thread, of course, shows up really well in the black fabrics. So I'm just going to complete this design and repeat the same thing all the way around the quilt. And here is the completed block. And you can see that variegated thread pretty well in this one. Now this block does have a little bit more quilting in it than the previous two did. And that's a few of them do have more quilting than the majority of them. But I think that worked out pretty well in this quilt. Now this block is called Girl's Favorite, and this has just two fabrics in it, an orange and a blue, and those two colors play real well against each other. Now for the center of this block, I chose to do a petal design, so I found the center of the block and just quilted that flower in all the way around. And I marked this one before I started the quilting because I did have to find the center of each of those sides of the black square there in order to get that design balanced. So that variegated thread is in that black fabric and looks really nice. And I think it adds quite a bit to the block. And for the next round, I'm working from the center out in this block. And for the next round, I'm doing a petal in the center, but I'm surrounding it by a swirl on each side. So I'm going to go ahead and do the swirl first, then do the petal, and then do the other swirl. And do that all the way around by following in the ditch with my ruler to get to the center of the next triangle. And one thing I was a little concerned about when I first started was doing the quilting with this variegated thread in the ditch of these black pieces, but that it didn't really distract from the design at all. And you can see I got my hopping foot caught on that corner there. That's where I think there are like 5 or 6 seams coming together at that point, and so that's a lot of fabric to get through, and every once in a while my hopping foot will get caught on there. And one thing you can do to avoid that is to raise your hopping foot, but that would mean raising it just for those sections and then lowering it again for the rest of the quilt, and that's too much hassle for me, so I just loosen it by hand and then just move on. That's just getting to know your machine and how well it works and how much work you have to go to find other solutions to the problem. So this is one that I decided to just work with what I had there and just move on. And then for the next round, I'm going to do the little blue triangles, and I'm just going to do a continuous curve in them and just moving my thread tails out of the way, which I could stop and cut those, but for some reason I decided to leave them. So I just thought maybe it might slow me down too much, I guess. So this quilting here goes pretty fast. This isn't a complicated design in this block either. It's pretty simple. Now for these corners here, these little corner squares, I decided to do a little feather, or excuse me, a little flower. And this is a cabbage rose with just one row of petals in it. And then I've chosen to just stitch in the ditch to the next square and do the rose in there. And what you could do is do the rose and then go on to the star points and do your quilting in those star points. But for this project, I decided to just do all those roses first. And if I remember correctly, I was starting to get a little tired at this point and was concerned that if I switched my pattern of quilting, I would get confused and wind up having to pick out a lot of stitches, which I was not in the mood to do. So I decided to just go around to each one of those triangles, or each one of those squares, and then go to the triangles from there. And in these triangles, instead of doing continuous curve, I decided to do a loop. And then I'm going to continuous curve in the background. And this is a block where I just continued using the variegated threads. So you can see that really well in the quilting here. Now those corner squares are going to get the cross canoes quilted in that. You can see where I've drawn them in two of those corners. And I will show that here in just a moment. But you can see if you just continue going around from the inside out, this quilting does go pretty fast. I'm cutting some more loose thread tails, and then I'll do the cross canoes in this corner. And then stitch in the ditch to the next corner and get that other little canoe quilted. And I believe I'm just tying off the stitches here. Now another thing I could have done was just to quilt those all as I was doing that outer round of the quilt at the same time, but once again, when I'm tired, I don't like to switch up my quilting designs too much because I do tend to make mistakes and wind up having to pull out stitches. So that little ruler comes in handy to do the stitch in the ditch to get to one point, from one point to another. And then here I'll show you the completed block. And I've got all of the chalk erased. And that is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. For more quilting ideas, click on the video links. And to keep up with my newest projects, click on the subscribe button. I hope to see you again soon.